The title of my presentation today is Destruction and Deconstruction in Piano Activities, 1962. In September 1962, at the Museum Wiesbaden in Germany, several Fluxus artists wielding axes, saws, bricks, and a tea kettle hit, hacked, and smashed a grand piano on stage. This was the piece Piano Activities, a score written by Philip Corner and interpreted for performance by George Maciunas as part of a European tour of Fluxus festivals. The Wiesbaden program featured many avant-garde works that challenged the culture of institutional art and music, such as Ben Patterson's Variations for Double Bass, in which Patterson performed his bass upside down and pulled scarves out of its body, and Namjoon Paik's Zen for Head, in which Paik dipped his hair in a bowl of paint and dragged it down a long scroll of paper. Of all these absurd and often comical performances, Piano Activities was perhaps the most dramatic and certainly the most destructive. In this presentation, I will examine three aspects of Piano Activities: the score, the performance, and its reception, to show how destruction, both material and symbolic, enables artistic freedom and rebellion. I also situate the destruction in Piano Activities within Fluxus's goals to redefine art, reject formal institutions, and connect with the everyday and general public. I am interested in destruction not necessarily as a sensationalist controversy and spectacle, although these definitely contribute to the impact Piano Activities had on audiences, but as a way to deconstruct the piano, and perhaps other musical instruments, and get at a new understanding of the relationships between instrument, artists, and audiences. I find Jared Pappas Kelly's concept of solvent form useful for analyzing destruction in works of art. In his book, Solvent Form, Art and Destruction, Pappas Kelly writes, quote, "To recognize the instability of the art object, we can return again to its solvent form, or an ability of art to posit something that at the same time is an undoing. In art's occasion, there is a struggle to make, or if not make, then reveal, the moment permeable, something capable of being returned to, as well as set apart." End quote. These competing forces, permanence and transience, are most visible, argues Pappas Kelly, in the destruction of the art object. Quote, "When art is destroyed, as if through some tethering of flux into fixed object, a thing becomes undone, or rather is shown to never be done. Thus, what we see in the destruction of art is a circumventing of an action that attempts to make fixed." End quote. The stability of the object is challenged in its material ruin, revealing the solvency of the artwork. If we consider the piano as an artwork, we see that it assumes permanence. Longevity with pianos is often valued, and to stay in working condition, pianos require regular maintenance and care. In addition, the furniture-like quality of the piano, with its solid form and level surfaces, creates a physical and functional sense of stability. However, like any musical instrument, pianos are subject to change. Constant maintenance fights against fluctuations in the internal balance of tension in the instrument, as in its tuning, or more permanently, degradation that may harm the piano's material, for example, changes in environmental humidity. Intentional or unrestrained destruction, therefore, undoes these efforts to maintain stability and disrupts the illusion of permanence, thus revealing a solvent form. Fluxus, as an artist collective, attitude, and idea, and this term intentionally evades any clear definition, similarly seeks an undoing of art, primarily in dissolving the institutions around art. The term Fluxus first originated as a magazine title that George Maciunas and Dick Higgins developed in 1961. Though the magazine itself never came to fruition, Maciunas, Higgins, and other artists eventually came together to organize a series of performances in Europe in the early 1960s. The Fluxus Festival in Wiesbaden in 1962 was the first of these concerts, and the event at which Piano Activities was first performed. Themes of destruction and reconstruction are evident in George Maciunas's manifesto, published in 1963. The text outlines three calls for action that present the goals and mission of Fluxus, each derived from a different definition of the word flux. Three verbs highlight Maciunas's mission: purge, promote, and fuse. These core actions enact a kind of solvency. Maciunas intends for destruction, purging, to undo institutionalized art, and through this transformation, develop connection, fusion, and renewal, or promotion. The manifesto was written in 1963, a year after Piano Activities was performed. Many artists actually refused to sign, concerned that having to adhere to this document might restrict their future work. In the end, Maciunas received only a few signatures in support, and so we should understand this primarily as Maciunas's manifesto. The document reflects the anti-institution and revolutionary sentiments that were manifest at the Wiesbaden Festival, and it will be important to keep in mind Maciunas's role as the early organizer of Fluxus and as a main influence in piano activities. The score for Philip Korner's piano activities details a list of ways that performers can sound a piano. Korner instructs that each player perform any of the following roles at the instrument: keyboard, pedal, and other parts of piano, which engage the strings and outer body of the instrument. Players are given many options for activities to perform, including muting the strings, scratching or rubbing with the hands or other materials such as cloth, glass, or metal, or dropping objects on the strings or body. An accompanying set of instructions titled The Impositions of Order outlines 6 possible arrangements for structuring sound making. For example, Order 1 assigns each player only one role and instructs a thorough exploration of sound in timbre, dynamics, articulation, juxtaposition, and evolution silences. Order 5, on the other hand, gives options for solos or duets among the participants. Korner's piano activity shares a close connection with a history of experimental piano performance, particularly John Cage's works for prepared pianos. Similar to Cage's pieces that approach playing the piano as a whole object, where every portion of the body has the potential to be sounded with human hands or found objects, Korner's piece also calls for redefining the piano's interfaces and sound possibilities. However, art historian Natalie Herron notes a key difference between Cage's prepared pianos and Korner's piano activities. While Cage's pieces are often written for a single performer, piano activities engages any number of players and, quote, stresses the collaborative and evolving nature of the interrelations between performers, piano, and additional props. Despite Korner's detailed instructions for piano activities, he was actually not involved with the planning for the Wiesbaden performance, and the piano destruction was George Maciunas's individual interpretation of Korner's score. In an interview with René Bloch from 1992, Ben Patterson and Emmett Williams recall the process of learning the piece. René Bloch: but it was an artistic event. It was a piece of music. There was a score. Emmett Williams: but this piano was destroyed from evening to evening. We were not following a score. The objective was to reduce this thing to nothing. Ben Patterson: I think, as a matter of fact, I never saw the original score. The way we learned the piece was through George's instructions. It was George's interpretation. He said, well, we're going to do this piece by Philip Korner, and this is the way we do it. And here are your tools, your instruments. Emmett Williams: and the instruments were there. A crowbar, hammers, rocks, George's interpretation. And we assisted, let's say. And there were saws. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Patterson and Williams attribute the concept of destruction to Maciunas, and do not recall even seeing the written score. This highlights the relevance of the manifesto to piano activities, which directly connects Maciunas's political and artistic visions to the performance. Fluxus started their 1962 European tour at the Museum Wiesbaden, where piano activities was performed over the course of several concerts. Various records of these performances exist, including 2 audio recordings, video clips from a German television broadcast, and many photographs. I'm going to play a short video clip from the television broadcast, and this will give you a sense of the sound, atmosphere, and performance activities. There's a voiceover in German that gives a little commentary on the piece, but this is not essential to understanding the clip.
Ein gutes Tier ist das Klavier, still, friedlich und bescheiden und muss dabei so mancherlei erdulden und erleiden. Wilhelm Busch scheint etwas vorausgeahnt zu haben. Und rasend wild, das Herz erfüllt von mörderischer Freude, durchwühlt er dann, soweit er kann, des Opfers Eingeweide. Piano Activities nennt sich diese Komposition. Es war einmal ein Flügel. Sollten andere Städte eifersüchtig werden, Gemach, die Dada-Musiker gehen auf Tournee. Kopenhagen, Paris und Düsseldorf stehen auf ihrer Liste. O seliger Mozart, keine Furcht, deine Musik darf immer noch den Haupteingang benutzen.
In this performance, Deconstruction literally opens the instrument, removing its lid and exposing the strings, to offer new interfaces for play and to enable group interaction. In this photo, for example, 7 artists are able to involve their hands and, in the case of Dick Higgins, his foot, in play. The piano is solvent here in form, as it is dismantled, and in instrumentality, as destruction transforms the piano into a kind of new instrument. Maciunas was well aware that his interpretation deviated from the score. In a letter to Lamont Young shortly after the performance, Maciunas acknowledged that his interpretation of piano activities was, quote, not according to Korner's instructions, end quote. He suggested that his interpretation was largely pragmatic. Quote, we systematically destroyed a piano which I bought for $5 and had to have it all cut up and throw away. Otherwise, we would have had to pay movers, a very practical composition, end quote. However, such a literal interpretation goes against the spirit of Fluxus, and it is hard to imagine that Maciunas's motivation was purely practical. In an earlier segment of their interview with René Bloch in 1992, Patterson and Williams reflect on Maciunas's justification. Emmett Williams. I can remember in 1962 when an Associated Press correspondent, Dick O'Regan, asked George why we had destroyed the piano. George answered that it was an old piano and it was a very practical way of getting rid of an old instrument that no longer had any musical value. That was George's justification. Ben Patterson. Well, his public justification. He always joked about things being practical. Emmett Williams. Because it certainly wasn't a practical way of getting rid of a grand piano. You could simply call a junkman and he would carry it away. But here, in the context of a museum and music and composers, it was a rather symbolic thing. Let's get rid of any vestige of the old music. Ben Patterson. Yes, very symbolic. Let's get rid of the past. It seems more likely that Maciunas's motivation was the symbolic gesture of performance, given that piano activities was performed at least 5 times over the course of the Wiesbaden Festival, rather than just destroyed over the course of one night. According to Fluxus historian Owen Smith, after the last night of piano activities, the piano was completely demolished and the pieces were auctioned off to the audience. Distributing art to the community for people to hold in their hands and keep was another dimension of Fluxus that Maciunas developed in the early 1960s, most notably in his production and distribution of little boxes and kits, as one example is shown in the photo here, which contains scores and activities for people to perform at home. Distributing the pieces of piano activities was akin to these souvenirs, though at no cost to the audience. Sometimes they would charge for these flux kits. The piano could not only be touched in this way, but actually owned by anyone, regardless of musical training. The destruction enacted in piano activities directly parallels the destruction suggested in Maciunas's manifesto, and could perhaps be read as a metaphor for his call to purge the world of various traditions. In a letter to Dick Higgins in 1963, Maciunas explained that he intended the audience for Fluxus works to be, quote, the masses, but not the pseudo-intellectuals, gallery and museum directors, and other decadent dilettantes. Those people will not lead to conversion so easily, and I think the easiest method to overcome them is to destroy them. If we can reduce the attendance of masses to these decadent institutions, we will increase the chance that they will turn their interests to Fluxus. Maciunas's intent to destroy bourgeois culture reflects the same kind of violence and urgency in his manifesto. While he does not express intent to destroy these institutions' physical property, and he was very careful to emphasize that it was his and not the museum's piano that was destroyed. He does seek a destruction of the values that these institutions uphold. Piano activities symbolically enacts Maciunas's call for radical change. Fluxus is the hammer, and the dominant institutions are the piano. In a letter to La Motte-Young, George Maciunas describes how the mayor and the larger German public reacted to the performance. Quote, "Wiesbaden was shocked. The mayor almost had to flee town for giving us the hall." End quote. Some of this upset can also be attributed to the miscommunication about the status of the piano being destroyed, since many audience members and newspaper journalists had assumed Fluxus had used the museum's piano for performance. And again, Maciunas was very clear in later communication to indicate that it was his piano. In her memoir, George Maciunas's mother recounts a much more impassioned and visceral reaction. Quote, "I, fortunately, did not see the program. The next day, I met the former landlady of our hotel on the street, and I was grieved by her sympathy. She had seen the previous evening's program and had been horrified. It showed how several young people, including my son, had destroyed a piano with hammers and axes. Even if the instrument was old and useless, it was noble. It had served talented hands which had given the public joy and rapture. It was painful and terrible to watch how the chips flew, to hear the complaining twanging of the severed strings. People couldn't hold back their tears, seeing such a shameful and tormenting end to the instrument. These people felt sorry for me, sympathizing and understanding how a mother's heart would ache seeing what her son was doing. The horror and pain that these viewers felt extends beyond the loss of the piano's function. Here, the piano is instead seen as a familiar and beloved instrument. Its destruction incites not feelings of exhilaration, but grief." About 25 years later, Ben Patterson recalls talking with Philip Corner, who was absent for the Wiesbaden performances. Quote, "He didn't complain about the way it was performed in 1962, but pointed out that it was not necessarily the way it had to be or should have been performed, even though he admitted that the score was open enough so that it could have been done that way. But he never conceived in his mind that it would end up happening that way." End quote. Corner's surprise further points to the destruction as Maciunas's interpretation, rather than something inherent in his score. The piano's ubiquity as a symbol for institutional art and as a familiar, beloved instrument is reflected in the many other piano destructions that also appear in other Fluxus compositions that similarly convey rebellion and anti-art sentiments. Works such as George Maciunas's Piano Piece No. 13 from 1962, shown on the left, and Nam June Paik's Clavier Integral from 1958 to 1963, shown on the right, was also inspired by John Cage's piano preparations and call for performative destruction of the piano, from nailing down the keys to splashing the instrument with paint. And in both these cases, these actions are intended by the composers themselves. And later, in 2012, Fluxus held a 50th anniversary concert at the Museum Wiesbaden, where an interactive installation titled Piano Interactivities allowed visitors to become Fluxus artists for a brief moment, as they operated a hatchet, hammer, and brick remotely over the internet. Through these investigations of score, performance, and reception, we have seen how piano activities is more than just the destruction of a piano. It is a symbol of Maciunas's anti-art sentiments, and it is an artistic act that transforms the piano's instrumentality. The unconventional activities and audience's mixed reactions indicate that the piano carries significant personal and cultural meaning. Reflecting on instrument destruction can help us understand these meanings from new perspectives. How would piano activities have been different if Maciunas had used the museum's piano, or even a brand new instrument? How would an instrumental variation of this piece, say oboe or snare drum activities, differ in affect and reception? Finally, piano activity shows us that destruction can be creative, inventing new interfaces, redefining meaning, and inviting community participation. There is much we can learn from sawdust and splinters. Thank you.